For generations, America has carried the scars of division, where color too often decides respect. From the streets to the stations, justice still wears shades. But today's story proves that tables do turn. So stay till the very end, because this time, power meets its own judgment. Rain fell hard over Atlanta's empty streets as Officer Danielle Harris drove home from a grueling undercover shift. Her badge was tucked deep in her pocket, her face weary but calm. The night was quiet until flashing red and blue lights suddenly filled her rearview mirror. A police cruiser trailed behind her, siren cutting through the rain. Confused, she pulled over near a gas station. Two white officers stepped out, Sergeant Miller and Officer Jenkins, their hands resting near their weapons, suspicion already burning in their eyes. "License and registration," Miller ordered sharply. Danielle frowned slightly. "Is there a reason I'm being stopped?" she asked. Jenkins smirked. "You fit the description." The familiar phrase stung. She moved slowly to grab her ID, but the officers instantly shouted, "Hands where I can see them." Within seconds, tension exploded. The woman who had spent her life upholding the law now found herself on the wrong end of it. The rain drummed harder as Miller circled the car like a predator. "Step out of the vehicle," he demanded. Danielle obeyed, raising her hands, her voice calm yet trembling with disbelief. "I'm an officer," she said, trying to show her badge. Miller scoffed. "Sure you are." Before she could speak again, cold metal cuffs clicked around her wrists. Jenkins pushed her against the hood of the car, his tone dripping with mockery. "You people always got a story," he muttered. The humiliation was sharp, cruel, undeserved. Her mind screamed for patience, for restraint, but her heart broke under the weight of how quickly color erased respect. The rain soaked her hair, her clothes, her pride. Around them, a few bystanders began to film. A woman's voice shouted, "She didn't do anything." Miller ignored it, forcing Danielle toward the squad car. Through the blur of lights and raindrops, she saw a young black boy standing on the sidewalk, watching silently. His wide eyes mirrored fear she knew too well. Fear of the uniform, fear of the system. She wanted to tell him it would be okay, that not all cops were like this, but even she couldn't believe those words anymore. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly, but Miller only laughed. "We'll see about that once we run your record." They shoved her into the back seat, shutting the door with a thud that echoed like a final insult. Inside the car, Danielle stared at her reflection in the rain-covered window. A law enforcer turned suspect. Her jaw tightened as she swallowed the anger burning in her chest. She wasn't going to beg, and she wasn't going to cry. Calmly, she looked up at Jenkins through the cage. "I get one call, right?" she asked. He smirked. "To who? Your boyfriend?" Danielle's lips curved into a cold, knowing smile. "No," she said softly, "to my captain." Her voice carried quiet power, the kind that made both men pause for a split second. They didn't know yet, but that single call would change their lives, and by morning, the same woman they mocked would decide their fate. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time the squad car rolled into the precinct parking lot. Danielle sat silently in the back seat, wrists still cuffed, her mind calm but sharp. She wasn't just thinking about what had happened. She was calculating what came next. Miller and Jenkins strutted ahead like heroes returning from battle, bragging to the desk officer that they had caught a suspicious woman driving through a restricted zone. None of them noticed the quiet authority in her eyes, or how she watched every movement, every smirk, every careless word. When they led her inside, the duty sergeant glanced up briefly, confused. "You arrest her for what exactly?" Miller shrugged. "Resisting, maybe. We'll figure it out." Danielle looked straight at him and said evenly, "You're making a mistake you won't forget." When they finally let her make her phone call, Miller rolled his eyes. "You got 1 minute." Danielle dialed a number she knew by heart. On the other end, a calm voice answered. "Captain Reynolds." She spoke clearly, her tone steady. "Sir, it's Harris. I need you at Central Precinct right now. I've been detained by 2 of your officers." The silence that followed was thunderous. "Harris?" Reynolds repeated, his voice rising. "You mean Detective Lieutenant Harris? Internal Affairs?" Miller's smirk vanished. Danielle turned her gaze to him and said quietly, "You might want to take those cuffs off." Jenkins froze. The atmosphere shifted instantly, the air thick with panic and disbelief. The power dynamic flipped in seconds. Minutes later, Captain Reynolds stormed through the precinct doors, fury blazing in his eyes. "Who the hell put my lieutenant in handcuffs?" he shouted. Every officer turned silent. Miller stepped forward, trying to explain. "Sir, she didn't identify herself properly." "She didn't have to," Reynolds cut him off. "You racially profiled a senior officer in her own city." His voice thundered across the room. The officers stood frozen as Reynolds unlocked Danielle's cuffs himself. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his tone heavy with guilt. Danielle rubbed her wrists, her expression unreadable. "Don't apologize to me," she replied softly. "Apologize to every person you've done this to who wasn't wearing a badge." Those words struck deep, leaving a silence heavier than rain. As the chaos unfolded, the crowd of civilians who had followed the arrest began gathering at the precinct doors, filming and shouting for answers. Videos were already going viral online. Black female officer arrested by white cops. Mistake of the year. The department's phones started ringing non-stop. Media vans appeared outside within the hour, and what had begun as another routine stop was now a public scandal. Danielle didn't yell, didn't demand vengeance. She just stood there, drenched and calm, watching the same officers who mocked her now trembling before her. "You wanted to make an example," she said quietly to Miller. "Now you are one." Her captain nodded grimly. "This won't go away," he said. "It shouldn't," Danielle answered, "because this time the badge won't protect them." By sunrise, the story had already swept through every news outlet in the city. "Black officer handcuffed by her own colleagues," the headline screamed. Clips from the gas station were playing on every major network. Danielle's calm face contrasted sharply with the aggression of Miller and Jenkins. Social media burned with outrage. Hashtags demanding justice trended nationwide. Inside the Atlanta Police Department, tension hung like smoke. Officers whispered in corners, glancing nervously whenever Danielle walked past. She was no longer just Lieutenant Harris. She was the woman whose silence had exposed the truth everyone pretended not to see. But behind her steady composure, Danielle carried the weight of something heavier. Years of watching prejudice rot the system from the inside. She had stayed quiet too long, believing she could change it from within. Now, silence was no longer an option. That morning, the Internal Affairs Board gathered in a small conference room lined with glass walls. Captain Reynolds sat beside Danielle, his jaw clenched. Across the table, Miller and Jenkins looked pale, their confidence gone. The chief entered, face tight with embarrassment. "This department has been humiliated," he said coldly. "Explain yourselves." Miller stumbled through excuses. "She didn't identify herself. It was dark. We were following procedure." Danielle waited patiently, then pulled out her body cam footage, one she'd been wearing even while off duty, recording from the moment she was stopped. The room fell silent as her calm voice played through the speakers. "Officer, is there a reason I'm being stopped?" Then Miller's mocking reply echoed, "You people always got a story." The chief's expression hardened. No more words were needed. The truth was undeniable. Outside the room, reporters filled the hallway, flashes popping through the glass walls like lightning. Danielle walked out first, her head high, ignoring the chaos. A journalist shouted, "Lieutenant Harris, will you press charges?" She paused, turned slightly toward the cameras and said, "This isn't just about me. This is about a culture that teaches officers to see color before character. That ends today." Her words echoed across the country within hours. In churches, classrooms, and coffee shops, people debated her courage. Some called her a hero. Others accused her of dividing the force. But Danielle didn't care for applause or outrage. All she wanted was truth. Raw, uncomfortable, necessary truth. That evening, as she returned home, the neighborhood she'd grown up in gathered on her porch. Old neighbors, teachers, even kids she once mentored in the youth program stood waiting with candles and signs that read, "Justice wears brown skin too." Tears welled in Danielle's eyes as a little girl ran up and hugged her. "You made them listen," the girl whispered. Danielle knelt down and smiled. "No, sweetheart," she said gently. "We made them listen." But even as hope stirred in her community, she knew the fight wasn't over. There would be backlash. The system never liked being challenged. And somewhere in the precinct, Miller and Jenkins sat in silence, realizing their world was crumbling. Tomorrow, they'd face the hearing that would decide their fate, and Danielle would be there to watch justice finally balance the scales. The next morning, the precinct felt colder than usual. Every hallway buzzed with tension, every conversation stopped when Danielle walked by. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp, but people were already lined up outside the conference hall, including reporters, activists, and off-duty officers who wanted to see what would unfold. For years, complaints of racial profiling had been buried, ignored, or dismissed. But today, there would be no hiding. Danielle sat quietly in the front row, her face calm but unreadable. Across the table sat Miller and Jenkins, stripped of their uniforms, now in plain gray suits that did nothing to hide their guilt. They didn't look so confident anymore. The chief entered, followed by a panel of senior officials, and as the doors closed, silence filled the room. "Let's begin," the chief said, his voice grave. Evidence after evidence was presented. The footage, the statements, the witness videos from the gas station. Each clip told the same story: arrogance, bias, abuse of power. Jenkins tried to defend himself, saying, "We were following procedure." Danielle raised her head, her voice calm but cutting through the air like steel. Procedure doesn't include humiliation. It doesn't include assuming someone's guilt because of their skin. Every eye in the room turned toward her. "You didn't see me as an officer. You saw me as a threat, and that's exactly what's broken in our system." Her words didn't come from anger. They came from truth, heavy, undeniable, and deeply human. Miller's eyes dropped to the floor. The chief nodded slowly, shame flickering across his face. "Lieutenant Harris is right," he said, "and it's time we stop pretending otherwise." Outside the precinct, crowds had gathered with signs demanding accountability. News cameras rolled as the verdict was announced. Both officers were terminated effective immediately and placed under federal review for misconduct. The room erupted with murmurs. Jenkins muttered something under his breath, but Miller just sat frozen, staring at the floor. Danielle stood up, not to celebrate but to close the moment with dignity. "Losing your badge isn't punishment," she said quietly. "It's an opportunity to remember what it was supposed to stand for." Her voice carried through the silence, a mix of sorrow and strength. Even those who once doubted her felt the weight of her words. Captain Reynolds walked up beside her, placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "You've done what most couldn't. You made the truth louder than the noise." As Danielle stepped outside into the sunlight, the crowd erupted in applause. Cameras flashed, but she didn't wave or smile. She just looked up at the sky, the same one that had poured rain over her humiliation days before, and exhaled deeply. A young reporter rushed forward, asking, "Lieutenant Harris, do you think justice was served?" Danielle paused, glancing at the people around her. Black, white, young, old, all watching her with hope. "Justice," she said softly, "isn't about punishment. It's about change. And if today made even one officer think before they act, then maybe we're finally starting." Her words rippled through the air like a quiet promise. As the cameras rolled and the crowd cheered, Danielle walked away from the building that once tried to break her head high, her badge gleaming once again on her chest. She hadn't just cleared her name, she had rewritten the story of what justice looked like in her city. And this time, the whole world was listening.